Hi, and welcome back to my second lecture for week 4. I want to continue the conversation that we were having last week about the professional voice and its politics. In trying to understand the idea of professional voice, I discussed 3 related topics: professionalism, professionalization, and professional persona. On one hand, I highlighted some of the common standards and routines that you should be aware of as you enter into either the workforce, graduate school, or whatever other professional situation that you might find yourself in. On the other hand, I emphasize that you should also be aware of the social inequalities that exist in these professional institutions, and that there is a politics to your professional voice. This week, we will pick up on that thread and shift our focus a little bit to professional life and professional culture. More specifically, we will focus on the social and political issues that arise when we think about the history and the social inequalities of professional institutions. Altogether, this week's conversation is designed to strengthen your critical consciousness of the professional world. This week's readings cover a range of related issues about the workplace, including structural racism, intersectionality, worker exploitation, and the psychology of perfectionism. Let's start with the Asia Gray article, The Bias of Professional Standards. In her article, Gray challenges our assumptions about professionalism. We often think of professionalism as a neutral or normal set of standards, behaviors, and expectations that are in any given workplace. But with a focus on Western countries, Gray points out that professional norms are in fact biased toward Western or European culture. In the big picture, this is an echo of the long history of white supremacy, that is, the history of European empire, genocide, slavery, anti-immigration, segregation, the history of racism, etc. In other words, there are a lot of deeply rooted power structures in many or even most professional institutions that are a legacy of this long and troubling history. The prejudices, assumptions, and the aggressions that manifest themselves in the workplace are sometimes blatant and conscious, but more often, they are an unconscious part of the everyday routine. It tends to be those who are privileged who are the ones who are less aware of things, and those that are oppressed in the work environment are usually well aware of what's going on because they are the people who are experiencing it. But sometimes, even the people who are oppressed in this situation start to normalize these biases and even police themselves in order to try to fit in. Altogether, this situation is very insidious, and it's not always easy to recognize just how deep the problems go. In sum, the point of the article is that professional cultures are in fact not neutral. And in the last section of the article, Gray goes on to outline a number of ways that employees, government regulators, and community partners can push for fairer standards and more equal treatment. The next article is titled The Effect of Intersectionality in the Workplace, which is written by Alina Tugend. This article cites many of the issues taken up in the last article, but this one uses the idea of intersectionality to better understand how structures of power work in professional institutions. Notice that at the beginning of the article, there is a YouTube video that's embedded. You should definitely watch it. The video is a presentation by an educator and activist named Brittany Packnett. Packnett defines and explains the idea of intersectionality very clearly and thoroughly. And by now you should all already know that intersectionality refers to how people simultaneously experience inequalities based on race and ethnicity, gender, class, sexuality, and ability. But Packnett expands on this topic even further. She points out that this theoretical idea is referring to something that people experience every day in real life. In short, there's no time to delay in using the idea to understand and resolve problems in the workplace. She goes even further to explain that the idea of intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, for example. It's not just a double burden for people who are part of 2 or more social groups. It is an exponential outcome of these different layers of discrimination. Furthermore, she points out that it isn't just a social problem. It is also part of institutional culture, and it shows itself in the interpersonal relationships that we have at work. The next article is Beth Daly's piece titled, Welcome to Your First Job. Expect to be underpaid, bullied, harassed, or exploited in some way. This somewhat depressing title speaks to a very real and serious issue that most of you will probably experience at one point or another, unfortunately. Many of you have already had work experience of your own, and actually, at this moment, you might be juggling a job and school. So, I'm sure the issues that are taken up in this article come as no surprise. The thing you should pay attention to is the way that this article uses research to deepen our understanding of the employment issues that are discussed, including economic exploitation, exposure to unsafe working conditions, bullying, sexual harassment, verbal harassment, and even physical violence. Now let's move to the last article for this week. This is titled, Under Neoliberalism, You Can Be Your Own Tyrannical Boss. It's written by Megan Day. Some of you may already be familiar with the concept of neoliberalism, but just so everybody is following along, I want to first give the topic some contextual support. So, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is an economic philosophy that links all kinds of social, cultural, and political issues. Historically speaking, it's an extension of an older philosophy called economic liberalism. This philosophy believed that free society is based on things like individualism, private property, and capitalist forces like free trade, competition, and the accumulation of profit. This economic philosophy was also very much against any kind of government regulation over business. This meant that workers had very few rights, and there were a lot of environmental and safety hazards that came along with it. It's basically social Darwinism for the economy. And it created huge amounts of wealth inequality in the US and elsewhere in the early 20th century. So back to the question, what is neoliberalism? What's the new part about it? So neoliberalism is a modern version of that older economic philosophy. It is now the de facto political system for world trade and most major countries in the world. And with the advent of new technologies, it is creeping further and further into culture and even into our own psychologies. For example, in this belief system that currently holds a lot of sway, our social lives and our social relationships are being pushed aside for extreme self-interest and competition, and our work environments are becoming more and more exploitive. The scary part is that most people have internalized these values and are barely aware of how the economic system is influencing their lives. This is where the article comes in. Day's central argument is that we are unwittingly falling into the trap of thinking this way, and we are policing others as well as ourselves to make sure that the market is running efficiently and productively. The problem is that all of this productive energy is going to line the pockets of the people who are on top. In the meantime, the rest of us are getting pushed further and further to the bottom. In the end, Day is making an argument that connects the larger political economy to professional culture and to our own psychologies. She is warning us not to be our own worst enemy. At the same time, she is also warning us to be careful about reproducing this unhealthy system with our coworkers. Okay, let's switch gears real quick and we can connect these readings to the public performance assignment. I think it would be useful to use them as a model to focus on composition. In the assignment, you're being asked to put together a presentation using a slideshow. You are going to use the same writing principles that go into creating an essay, but you're going to be instead creating a slideshow which is a slightly different animal. So what are the lessons about composition that we can take away then? First, notice that the titles of the articles have an indication to what the topic is and what the thesis is. This is always worth observing. Secondly, notice the use of subtitles in these articles. Each of the articles are using subheadings to signal to the reader what the outline of the article is. This gives a reader a sense of what the logical development is. So instead of just reading the text, you can just keep an eye on the subtitles and get a general idea of how the article operates. If you remember the earlier readings, they also use subtitles to help guide the reader through their in-depth arguments. For practices here in the CAT program, we try to discourage students from using these kinds of subheadings because the things that you're writing are usually pretty short. So we prefer that you rely on your transition skills and your framework skills between body paragraphs in order to do the same kind of work. But for this assignment, because you're creating a slideshow, subtitles can actually be quite helpful. You don't want to have a subheading for every single slide, but you probably want to have a few subheadings in the mix in order to signal to the reader what your outline is. The third thing to notice about this week's readings is that many of them used research to back up the claims that they were making in the articles. We know that in the background, the author probably did a lot more research than is shown in the articles. So pay attention to the curation that the author did in order to put that research into kind of small, simple, digestible pieces that a regular audience can understand. Also notice how the authors used summaries, bullet points, and easy-to-read graphs in order to communicate what they found in their research. So with attention to your presentations, the point here is that doing research is one thing, but presenting your research to the audience is another. The last thing we want to look at is how these articles used something called journalistic writing. In this style of writing, you start off with the lead, so to speak. You don't drag the reader along as you slowly get to your point. You make your argument first, and then you start to unpack the details behind it. We see the same principle in essay writing when we have the thesis in the introduction rather than the conclusion. And we can also see the same principle at work in the way that topic sentences work in your body paragraphs. As you go into the presentation then, just remember to be strategic about how you organize the slides and about what kind of information goes in the slides. Remember to stay on topic and don't delay when you're getting to the point. Establish your main points first and then unpack them for your audience. So good luck everybody this week.